I mean, for the U.S., or to the U.S., Korea is one of their concerns.
Exactly.
Among numerous concerns they have, and which they focus on will determine how much of a concern it will be. In a way, because of their present engagement or disengagement or conflict or confrontation with China,
Yes.
becoming their main concern, South Korea in a way can become a concern. In a way, if we play our cards right, we can have more influence over US because of China.
I like the way you put that.
Yeah.
Because another person would have the same introduction, but they would say, South Korea is going to get caught. It's a shrimp among whales and blah, blah.
Yeah.
But you said it the other way. You said South Korea has opportunities because
Yes.
it's close to China.
Yeah.
I think that's true. And I think that's part of the growing up of South Korean leadership in coming years, if they decide to take it. They know China better than the US does in some ways. And they obviously have interests there. And, you know, I've been reading the terrible analyses in Washington from scholars and others for years about how South Korea is going to lean toward China. One of these futurists. Remember that Kim Dae-jung loved to talk to the futurists back in the 90s?
Yes.
Alvin Toffler.
Yes, very much so, yes.
One of them wrote a book about Northeast Asia, and he was saying, well, obviously South Korea is going to go to China. It's leaning that way, and that's what's going to happen in the future. I mean, anyone who polls South Koreans are like, no, not going to happen.
Yeah.
So, but its ability to tell the U.S., to help the U.S. deal with China is a really big thing, a big piece of soft power that could contribute to South Korea's growing role. I think you're right. And in the same way, you know, Biden's very simplistic embrace of an anti-China organizing principle for American foreign policy is just crazy. Most of our best foreign policy thinkers are screaming about this. They can't believe that with all that's going on, that's what Biden has reduced his policy to is anti-China. I mean, yes, we have to confront them on overreach and other things, but they're not an existential threat to us. They're not trying to take over the world. We have a lot of things to do that have nothing to do with China.
The problem is that China actually created this threat image by overstepping its boundaries. I mean, Emperor Xi has now become so attached with this China being a global power and to flex its influence over the entire world I think, has made these worrying countries around, especially U.S., become more legitimate, a legitimate threat to them.
I think you're very right about that, and he's made it easy for people to exaggerate the China threat.
Yeah.
But you know, that's a complicated picture in China. If you listen to historians of China, they would not accept this at all. They wouldn't buy that China boogeyman thing at all. And one of the most prominent has said for years that Xi Jinping's extension of his rule, for instance, he said, this is not an expression of strength. This is because he doesn't want this whole thing to fall apart. Of course, it's complicated, but they have all sorts of problems that they're dealing with at home.
Oh, yeah.
And I certainly would reiterate, they have to be confronted whenever they're trying to bully other countries on their periphery, and the sea lanes must remain open. But one of our best thinkers, Professor Stephen Walt at Harvard, has pointed out several times that they're not expansionists. They're not trying to take over other countries far away. It's all reflected in our domestic debates. But the exaggeration of China's threat is a very big and concerning thing, because if that leads you to unending arms expenditures, then we are just continuing down a road that has impoverished our country, my country. We have inequality that we've never had before. Our health system is practically collapsed. Obama's helped it a lot.
Yeah.
And now I think we've passed a new law that will help. But, we have so far to go in terms of rebuilding our infrastructure and stuff. So, I love that we're doing that. But those are the real primary businesses of an American government. Standing up to China by spending $700 billion a year is probably not a very wise thing.
That's very true, and I agree with that as a valid point. But at the same time, when we look at China, 1.4 billion, and if what the Chinese government is trying to do is to make all 1.4 billion people prosperous, is something that is a challenge to the global system. It becomes unsustainable. If everyone in China owns a motor vehicle, or automobile, refrigerator, air conditioning, blah, 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 and then they consume, and then natural resource, it will be a black hole for the world, global, and it's not sustainable.
I agree. And I think in a way, what the argument you're making is a very good argument to expand your cooperation with China on everything to do with environmental stuff. They know this. They have to live in China. They're not going anywhere. And if China is polluting itself, if it's building up plastic debris, blah, 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 there's nowhere for them to go. So they have a lot of interest in cooperating with us. Thankfully, we have John Kerry from the U.S. Trying to do this. And at least he's a good guy trying. But no, your point is right, and that's not sustainable. But as Walt points out, China's not so much trying to make its own rules. It's trying to use the international rules. It's not trying to overturn the rule book. It's trying to have a say in making the rules. Those things that would allow China to have a bigger voice in making the rules have been often blocked by the U.S. That's just got to stop. We have to have China, maybe India and South Korea, have to be at the table now. So in that sense, some of these most important international institutions need to be upgraded and modernized in order to reflect the real interests at the table. And this is another thing, together with environmental issues, which would loop in China for more cooperation with the rest of us. Finally, to finish up on Walt, one of his main points is simply that China doesn't have any strategic interest in overturning all these rules. They've made themselves rich by international trade and everything else. They go to court, they use the international system. If that system were to somehow stop, it wouldn't be good for China at all. Plus, what is the Malacca Strait? There are all sorts of indications that China needs open sea lanes almost more than other countries do. So the idea that they're going to block the sea lanes, this is one of the most favorite China scare tactics. No, they probably aren't. It just doesn't make any sense.
I think the concern of the U.S. is that the hegemony of the global system may be taken over by China. And that is what China's intentions are. I mean, Xi has been clearly saying that in his so-called China dream, and he has indicated when he will economically become number one, China will become, and then
China 2025.
Yeah, militarily they will be able to overcome U.S. and become world number one by 2050 or something like that. And this is a outright challenge to the U.S. and the system that the U.S. represents and the countries that follow that system. It's kind of a bit of a threat and a fear. So that's why we are grouping against China in that sense, because China in itself, 1.4 billion, I mean, it's a world in its own, I mean.
Yes, yes. Well, one of the things that results from that is on China's periphery, countries are getting together to push back. You know, Vietnam in particular, you know, Malaysia, the Philippines, South Korea, Japan. I mean, Japan is in some ways the American aircraft carrier in East Asia. They're, you know, this conservative government is fine with all this. So if you look at the balance of military forces, China's not going to. They can't even stand up to this. They can't. It's not a believable scenario for China to somehow, you know, overtake the others militarily. And in terms of rule of law, very similar thing. You know, all of these countries are members of the UN. They also have a lot of military agreements with the United States, among each other, ASEAN. There are all sorts of international arrangements that strengthen countries if they want to band together to resist China's bullying.
That's the point. They cannot band together unilaterally. I mean, they're not united. You see what's happening to ASEAN, how the Chinese are sort of putting a wedge through that by outrightly bribing Cambodia and countries like Myanmar. And so I think China realizes that there is not a united front because it sort of...
I would disagree.
Really?
Yes. I mean, I take your point that there's not a united front. But I don't think it needs to be a united front. It needs to be where those countries, many of them, particularly the ones with the biggest stake or the most to lose from bullying by China, link together and either through international law or through agreements with the US or visits or statements that, you know, they find ways to push back. And there are limits to what they will take. I think that really is happening. And I don't think they're on tender legs here. I think that particularly with the US as backup, you know, now, if anything, we're overdoing our, you know, let's stand up to China. So I would say that it's less of a worry now, simply because the demonstrated example of many countries is to push back. You're certainly right that it will go okay sometimes. There's attempts to bribe. But look what you're not seeing. You're not seeing threats of invasion. You're not seeing violence yet, hopefully. And some of these countries have reasonably good militaries, and they'll probably get better. So I don't think it's at all over. And I also don't think it's an accurate description of China that they're somehow hell-bent on overturning all this. It doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, I mean, it's not the Chinese Communist Party, in order for its survival and maintaining its hold over its own country, to hold together that huge population, they have to keep on providing them with the people with the things that they demand, they require. And in order to do that, they may sometimes overstep and overplay their welcome outside of China. Because, I mean, although now Xi Jinping's, because of the so-called confrontation or conflict with the rest of the world, or many of the world countries, they are looking at domestic growth and domestic markets and this and that. That's what the Chinese government is now. They're looking inward rather than outward.
Exactly,
But at the same time, they still need outside
yes, investment and interaction.
And technology. And that is now not going to be as simple or easy as before.
I completely agree. And I think two things show this in a very clear way that push back against those who say China is going to take over the world. And this is obviously a very active debate in Washington. You know, serious people are debating. But one of those examples would be about not the law of the sea, but when China deals with businesses, international businesses inside China. We now have several years in which they've been particularly rapacious and demanding of businesses. Many of those businesses have said, I can't do this anymore. I'm losing too much. The Chinese have taken my intellectual property. They're taking too much tax, blah, 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 blah. And this is continuing.
Yeah.
As you pointed out, the climate in China for businesses is getting worse and worse. So that's actually a big deal because they need those businesses. That's part of their growth. The other thing is on democracy. Chinese behavior in Hong Kong goes far beyond Hong Kong. It's a terrible tragedy what's happening there. We have seen that.
Yes.
But what it tells everybody else about China is crystal clear. You can't look away. That tells you who these folks are, their leadership, and how they see their core interests. And nobody is going to forget that. Those images we've seen, and it's actually a bit of a comment on current technology, that we can see all these images in real time. You cannot look away from this. So whatever the Communist Party thinks that they're going to do, I think they'd better think 2 or 3 times, because the rest of the world can see exactly who they're trying to be.
It's a dilemma for them as well, because they can't back down, and yet if you continue, the outcome will be a very hostile world that they will face. It's not like, China's huge market, what's in it for us? Yeah, we can gain something. Now China is very scary. How can we stop China? Is the changed mood now, and that's actually caused by the Chinese themselves and Chinese leadership.
I think that's a big deal, and I think in some ways it's the biggest deal because they have to be watching this, but governments have to. They have to deal with what businesses are doing in the current international environment, with money sloshing around and businesses going where they want. And as you say, if China is showing itself to be untrustworthy for businesses and untrustworthy as a, maybe as a big money lender and things like this, well, then, that has real consequences. You can't, there's a limit to what you can do.
Already the Belt and Road Initiative has shown the way that China treats its recipients.
Sometimes.
Yes, by taking over as collateral or whatever. This is taking over the national property of ports and then of course there's no incentive for these donors or the recipients, because Chinese provide all the workforces. The Chinese are sort of import or exported to these countries, and the local people have no benefit from these development programs. So it's the way they conduct their so-called engagement with the Belt and Road Initiative is not very attractive.
Well, there's a scholar in Washington who's been watching the Belt and Road. He's very good. He's a top scholar, and he's been writing for years that we should look at this very closely, because obviously there is a degree of corruption, as there always is in Chinese big infrastructure projects like that. But there's also a bit of coercion that could be done in some of these. He says it's not exactly what the alarmists claim, but it's there. And his point is, that large infrastructure project, it's not really one project, it's a link of and a lot of it is long overdue across China and across the Asian continent. Also, it connects to, southeastern Russia and far eastern China and the Korean Peninsula. And his point is, a smart thing to do would be to start to get into that. Start to have your companies or other investment units take part in the Belt and Road on the condition that we have elevated rules, transparency, best practices, and that this becomes a much less corrupt and much more trustworthy and durable thing, this infrastructure building. And it connects to, as you saw, what I've been working on for years is the infrastructure surrounding the Korean Peninsula. Obviously the east and west coasts, but also Japan, Korea. This is, I think, inevitable.
The only problem is what you pinpointed, that the Chinese will not be that transparent, will not be that so-called open source kind of attitude. Like the North Koreans, it's very difficult because they have their own way of doing things, and the corrupt system that they have is the fundamental problem there. The Chinese, of course, you have all these so-called government initiative corporations that are huge, enormous, and then all these private institutions or private companies are now under scrutiny.
They're not really private.
But still, even like Alibaba, the kind of thing that, because of what Mawin has said, it was very, I thought it was very mild what he said. And now look at him, look what's happened to him. And the other companies that are, the Communist Party is beginning to sort of put under their control, not allowing freedom of these companies. And putting, and these so-called government initiated companies, they may be huge, but they are so bureaucratic and corrupt, and only looking towards the Communist Party as for guidance, they can't compete.
Well, isn't this one reason why Huawei has been rejected by so many Western countries, and why the U.S. is on a crazy, insertion of Communist Party people in Huawei businesses and so on, so that, if you bought some equipment and you're a European company and you need it to be serviced, you call Huawei and they have somebody, and that guy gets a call from the Communist Party, put a bug in here.
There is already existing backdoors, they call it.
But I do think the larger issue with both China and North Korea is that if they want investment, it's simply not their decision to make. It's pretty close to a yes or no, either or. And clearly in today's climate, with everybody now knowing what they know, neither North Korea or China will get increasing investment from the West, from the big companies, if they're not more transparent. There will never be 100% freedom of corruption. There isn't in the United States. But you can do an awful lot, and particularly with investment in North Korea. Because you're starting with a clean slate, and because North Korea needs everything, you have so much leverage.
This is the frustrating thing. North Korea knows the situation, but they cannot be transparent. They cannot open up, because that means it will sort of collapse the foundation of what they represent. I mean, if they start to reform and change, you remember during the Kim Dae-jung days, Kim Jong-il, of course, was very close to all this because after Kim Il-sung's sudden death, and then they had this real tough time period.
Yes.
And in a way, Kim Dae-jung provided them with a rope for a dying man or a drowning man or whatever, and they were able to come up. But the more they engage with South Korea, they realize how it sort of influenced the population and how people's thinking begin to change. And this is frightening stuff for the regime, for the government. So they needed to control that and contain that, or else.
I think this has always been true, except that you have to take into account the countervailing, very strong waves. And those are, this family, the Kim family, has been in charge for 3 generations now. They would rather not let this go, and oh my God, all hell will break loose when this is just a fight among different bureaucratic people. If you imagine it from their point of view, let's try to keep this going. The obvious key to that, since Kim Il-sung, has been to try to grow the economy and try to make living standards better. Kim Jong-un, because he was partly educated in Sweden, and he's just, or Switzerland. And he's a bit more of a modern person. And these letters are interesting that way too, because you hear a little bit more of his voice than you usually do. He very much knows this dilemma that you're describing, but the ability of this family and Kim and this leadership to actually open up the gates of investment and growth and start North Korea growing a bit more. Oil comes in, agriculture begins to be resuscitated, and so on and so forth, healthcare. That pushes completely against, or not completely, but very much against this whole countervailing wave of, they're learning more about the outside so they can see that their government is not democratic. Frankly, we know very well that people's first thoughts when they're starving are not, gee, I want a democracy.
Yeah, I mean, exactly that. I mean, the system that they claim is not working. I mean,
Right.
It's not providing the people with the things that they need.
Well, that's why, the trade-off, and it has been clear for more than 20 years, the agreed framework was not perfect. We all remember the deal and where we were. A lot of people conveniently forget how bad the Americans were at keeping their part of the bargain. Two things were true during that whole, it was signed in 94, and Bush came in 2001 and started breaking it, and the Koreans finally said, what the hell, in 2003. But that deal very much baked in that the North would begin to open its doors to investment, but they would have inspectors. And yes, they were starting to gather information to start a uranium program. And we knew this for years. But given that the Americans could have sat down, if it hadn't been Bush, if it had been Gore, if they sat down with the North Koreans and said, we see that you've imported these things, we're going to have to stop that. Because if we don't, I'm afraid that all of our cooperation is going to stop. This would not have been a big decision for them. So my point is simply that the leverage is very much on the side of South Korea and the U.S.
Well, those were the lost opportunities. Yeah.
They truly were. Timing is so much. I could go on and on. I mean, one of the things I'm writing now is about how Kim Dae-jung and Bill Clinton were both very lucky that they had each other on the Korea issues. Because imagine both of them, what would they have done if they had some other guy? Both would have been.
I mean, they got along very well. They respected each other, and then Clinton listened to Kim Dae-jung, and we even had these high-level visits between North Korea to the White House. And,
yes,
and
that's right. Jom Young-rok.
Again, timing. I mean, it was the end of the Clinton presidency, and time was too short to complete the deal, so to speak. And then came Bush, which went the complete opposite way.
But I think that's a good point to pick up. Timing. If we take that as a construct going forward, the next 6 months, obviously, Moon Jae-in, but after that, another South Korean president.
The difference is now North Korea is a de facto nuclear state. In those days, during the Clinton days, it was not a de facto nuclear state.
They had no nuclear weapons at all.
Yeah.
They also had no ICBM.
Yes, but now they have both. And this is a very different situation where the dealing between the two sides will not be the same.
It is different. One has to acknowledge that. And yet, some elements are not different at all. What North Korea needs is no different.
No, that's true.
It just isn't any different. And therefore, the leverage that we have collectively, the US and South Korea, is not much different. I understand that there's a bit more to get from North Korea, but the leverage is still there. And when you think about timing and you think about this period when there's a Democrat in the White House or an international person, Joe Biden, yes, many of us are frustrated that he hasn't been able to do things we thought he could do, but the jury is out. It's early. What if the South Koreans take advantage of this open window? And by the way, on the North Korean side, yes, they have nukes and missiles, but they also have a leader who's a bit younger and who's a bit more able to speak. You cannot imagine either Kim Jong-il or Kim Il-sung making these statements and talking the way he does, or even his sister. I mean, I fully appreciate the rather crude nature of some of the public expressions when both sides are very frustrated. Mm-hmm. But both of them, they were in school together in Switzerland. So she was there too. This is, for a North Korean, that's a huge deal. Mm-hmm. It makes them different from almost every other North Korean. And it gives a possibility of an opportunity to the next, the US government when it finally finds its legs, and the next South Korean government. It's an open door, who knows?
Well, I don't know whether the new government that will come in can go either way. I mean,
I know. Believe me, that's one reason I'm here. Oh my God!
It can go either way, and it also
President Yoon,
President Yoon, or President Lee, or President question mark, whatever. But the approaches, of course, will be completely different between the two potential president-to-be or president-elect. But again, circumstances, opportunities, or missed opportunities, whatever, it will determine the outcome. And I am still confounded as to how North Korea can maintain their position so rigidly, without compromising, without trying to accommodate some of the approaches or the initiatives or the suggestions, recommendations given by South Korea or the US.
Yeah.
They are strongly trying to continue to say and demand what they want.
Yes.
Without any kind of compromise. It's confounding because we know the difficult situation that North Korea is in economically. So they're even willing to allow their people to go into this kind of painful period rather than accommodating the views of South Korea or the US.
Those letters from the last 3 years paint a different picture.
Does it?
Yes. And it's a picture that should be familiar. It's not that they're not willing to compromise at all. It's that the Americans refused to give 1 inch. They waited all during the Trump presidency for some indication that the Americans would give something. They gave small things. And he said several times in these letters, and of course we were all watching, and we always waited, and the Americans always said, oh, privately we're doing, blah. Well, no, they weren't. And they never were. And in fact, in the weeks before Hanoi, 2 American officials spoke at Stanford University, Stephen Biegun and the other guy.
CVID.
Exactly. Well, both of them said very clearly, everybody's waiting. When are they going to talk about sanctions? Because that's, for a year, North Korea has been saying, excuse me, if we can begin to get out from under these sanctions, then we'll begin to deal. So that's what North was saying. They're getting ready to meet. And Biegun and Kim say, we're not going to relieve sanctions at all. We might throw them a couple of crumbs. We have a video about resorts in North Korea and how beautiful they would be, but we don't have anything to give them. So the game was up before they ever got to Hanoi. The Americans were not going to give a goddamn thing. That's where we are. And these letters sort of just confirm what we all saw there. This has nothing to do with being nice to North Korea. This is about stopping those damn nuclear programs and beginning to have some progress, particularly for South Korea. As we said earlier, for South Korea, North Korea is on the border, and they're Koreans. And this region, this is your backyard. It's not the American backyard. And as much as some officials would do the right thing, they're in a system in the US where it's just not a priority.
You got involved in Korean politics and Korean affairs since the early 90s. What prompted you to be interested in Korea? I mean, obviously you're not a Korean major or something like that.
No, and my undergraduate major was, since I was a teenager, I was interested in foreign affairs. I just was. I don't know why, sort of organic. Finally moved to Washington in 1988 and began to work. A work colleague told me, hey, I have a friend who runs a international consulting. And I said, oh, international? So I talked to him, and it was him and his wife and a secretary. But he was a very unusual guy. So I got this job. And very quickly, I'm vice president, which I'm thinking, oh, isn't that nice? But it was really serious stuff. My boss had been a Democratic Party guy in the U.S. Democratic Party, and he'd been outreach to Democrats. Benazir Bhutto, Raul Manglapas, Kim Dae-jung, and others. And we represented overseas foundations. That's why the Luso-American Development Foundation in Portugal was a big client of ours. Our two biggest clients were them and Kim Dae-jung and the Democratic Party. So that was my introduction to Korea and Kim.
I see.
And as soon as I started working with the South Korean Democrats, I wasn't a total novice to this. I've been sort of watching international events for years. And as slow as I was, it dawned on me, oh my God, you have this unusual access to these really powerful people in politics who are trying to change South Korea for the better. Hold on. This is more interesting and more important than anything else you're doing. So that gave me a feeling that, geez, at least in this town, I can contribute something. I have something to do. So I've tried. I've been in the think tanks. I've been writing articles and meeting with people. I have good friends in this who've been with it for decades. So that might explain why it's such a singular thing to me. The final piece is that when I've come to Korea over 30 years, all Koreans have treated me so well. I have some of my best friends here, and everybody has been so good to me that it's in a way not fair, but I just feel very lucky. So that's how it looks.
So you'll continue as long as you're able to.
Well, it's so interesting. Right now you have a presidential election, we have a new government. It might all go to hell, but maybe not.
That's true. Anyway, it's good to see you, and hopefully the new government that comes in Korea will be able to benefit from your insight and your thoughts concerning of Korea and U.S. politics and whatnots. Anyway, as you said, for 30 years now you've been engaged very deeply and engaged with Korea, so it's a part of you.
Very much. This is my second city. I was thinking the other day, walking around, that in my current town in Bethesda, I've only lived there for 22 years. Not as long as I've been coming to Seoul. So in a way, this is almost my first city. It's so good to see you. It really is good. We have to have some more long talks.
Yes.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for your insights.